Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before we go anywhere, please let's take a moment to remember exactly what day this is. Remember those who died doing the things they did every day, and those who died doing extraordinary and heroic things to save other people. Remember the people that survived to tell the stories. And remember the dawning recognition in this country that there are people in the world who live to die and live to see us die. Us being Americans, Westerners, Israelis, Jews, Christians, and anyone, including Muslims, who would stand up to fight for free societies. And remember our soldiers who did exactly that. Thank you. Today, I have a real privilege. For those of you who follow the JPC on X, and all of you should, you know that one of our most frequent admonitions is, if you want a military view, ask a military person, not Tom Friedman, not a pundit, not a politician. We have a military person with us today. David Katz is going to talk about the military ramifications of Israel's war in Gaza and ways to think about and move beyond the fighting war. To be clear, this is not a discussion of the rightness or wrongness of decisions made by the Israeli government. We don't do that. But this decision has been made. And so we're going to look at it, try to understand it, how to think about it, and think about what will come next. David has a lot to tell us. So today we're going to go with the short JPC commercial. We were founded in 1985 to provide perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policy by politics. No politicians here, never, no politicians. Scholars, academics, and commentators. And yes, I know we have been remiss on the domestic side. We're going to fix that. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. You can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine, In Focus Quarterly. The fall issue of In Focus is under construction. It is entitled Borders, Identity, and Crisis. You can guess the rest. I hope you've seen the revitalized In Context section on our website as well. We're running a lot of up-to-the-minute information and commentary there, and you can download all the previous webinars. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Right now, as it has been since October 7th, our most important job is to support the government of Israel and the IDF in their defense of the people and borders of Israel, ensuring that Hamas has neither the military nor the governing capability it had in Gaza, and securing the release of all the hostages, alive and no longer alive. So all the details about the strike in Qatar are not available, and we're not going to go there today. But it had been our hope for a little while to be able to call September 9th Gaza Liberation Day, in the hope that Israelis and Palestinians were liberated from the malign influence and behavior of Hamas. But I guess not. Our guest today, David Katz. David is president and CEO of Daracom, a strategic competition advisory firm. During his tenure at U.S. Special Operations Command, he designed, advised, and assisted in the execution of the largest counter-PRC strategic competition operation since the Cold War. That is going to require a question later in the day. A West Point graduate, he served in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer and a Green Beret captain. He also worked as a private equity institutional investor and advisor before founding his own firm that provided advanced analytics on more than $3 billion of clients' private equity investments. His publications include, first of all, the one you received with your invitation today, Beyond Military Victory in Gaza, which is also on our website, as well as Toward a Strategic Art for Sanctions, Multidimensionality, Rethinking Power Projection for the 21st Century, and Waging Financial Warfare, Why and How. Now, while we'd love to have some analytics on equity investments and waging financial warfare, we are probably going to stick with military operations today. And on that note, David Katz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shoshana, and thanks to the Jewish Policy Center for hosting me and this webinar today. I hope we have a good time and we cover some subjects. And to preview what I'm going to talk about, let me tell you what we're going to cover, or at least what I'll talk about. We'll lay out the situation in Gaza. We'll connect policy, Israeli policy to Israeli strategy, their strategy to operations and their operations to tactics throughout our discussion. We'll define Israel's problem in Gaza and propose a solution. And we'll present a strategy and strategic objectives in detail that help them get to where they need to go. While laying out strategic objectives, we will, by necessity, have to discuss what a military end state is and how to get beyond it. We'll also lay out a phased approach and a timeline with success metrics and transition criteria. And perhaps if we have time, lastly, we'll talk about the failures of Israeli and American strategic culture and why it matters. If we have time and you're interested, we can go into explicit operational details, means and methods, and of course, whatever questions you may have. So let's cover the situation. On October 7th, 2023, approximately 3,800 Hamas fighters, and accompanied by 2,200 Gazan civilians, invaded Israel and killed roughly 1,200 Israeli citizens, wounded 7,500, kidnapped 250. Since October 7th, Hamas has fired approximately 12,000 rockets into Israel, while Hezbollah on the northern border from Lebanon has launched more than 12,400 rockets, hundreds of drones, and have engaged Israeli forces with guided anti-tank missiles. Roughly 200,000 Israelis have been internally displaced, and on March 18th, 2025, the Israeli Defense Forces launched a focused ground operation in central Gaza with elements of 3 army divisions entitled Operation Gideon's Chariot. So that's the situation. Let's talk a little bit about war and the political objective of war and what the Israelis will then want to accomplish here. So when we think of war, typically in the West, we think of the German military strategist Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote that war is an act of force to compel one enemy to do one's will. But what war does is to continue policy by other means. So what is the political objective of Operation Gideon's Chariots? What policy does it pursue? Well, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, stated policy is the removal of any security threat from the Gaza Strip long term. In my thinking, he wants Gaza to cease to be an existential threat to Israel permanently. Now, Shoshana chides me about the use of permanent. I should reserve it for nothing but death and taxes. But when we get to talking strategy, I'll tell you what permanency is in terms of this strategic objective and in years, so it can be measurable. So policy generates policy objectives. The stated policy objectives for Gideon's Chariots are the destruction of the military capabilities and governmental infrastructure of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the return of the hostages abducted on October 7th, establishment of a security buffer zone on the Palestinian side of the Strip's border, demilitarization beyond the needs for public security, de-radicalization in all religious, educational, and welfare institutions in Gaza, and administration by local officials who have administrative experience and who are not tied to countries or entities that support terrorism. It's all pretty nice. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that Israel has been there in Gaza and what it is currently doing multiple times in the past. Israel's past operations, Operation Cast Lead in 2008, Pillar of Defense in 2012, and Protective Edge in 2014. And now we have Operation Gideon's Chariots. Remember that Israel acquired Gaza in 1967, has held it for 58 years. Israel is repeating crisis response operations episodically. That typically means that your strategy, if you have one, has failed. I believe that their past operations and possibly Operation Gideon's Chariot will fail because they focused on reducing Hamas's capacity, its resources, its fighters, its weapons, its infrastructure, and funding, rather than destroying Hamas's capability, which is its underlying ability to generate, regenerate, or reconstitute those resources over time. More broadly, Israel failed because it used a magnificent military instrument, the IDF, and military strategy to attempt to obtain objectives beyond a military end state. It really is the classic case of square peg, round hole. And if Israel wants to solve the problem of Hamas and Gaza, it needs to change its approach. If they don't, Israel will face a future of repeated crisis response operations, each more dangerous and more expensive than the past. And more importantly, Israel will face a future more dangerous than October 7th. Imagine, if you will, a small, cheap, radar-transparent drone launched from Gaza, carrying perhaps 2 pounds of powdered enriched uranium-235 from Iran. Its target, Tel Aviv. Its intention, to airburst over the city, rendering it uninhabitable for the half-life of U-235, which is 700 million years. If Iron Dome shoots it down anywhere over Israel, you've done the terrorist job for them. What's the answer? Well, I propose a thesis that Hamas's genocidal ambitions have collapsed Gaza into destruction, forfeiting its right to independence. Simply reducing Hamas's capability and capacity while returning Gaza to a stateless vulnerability ensures that it will become a proxy for external actors seeking Israel's destruction. Gaza must be generationally transformed into a political economy structurally unable of armed organized violence. It must have a stable peace and become an allied commonwealth harmonized with Israel's civic and legal polities and aligned with Israel's founding principles. Success in Gaza will demonstrate to other potential aggressors that genocidal wars result in complete political extinction. This will establish a deterrent effect that incremental responses cannot achieve. So, as we've talked a little bit about generating policy objectives are themselves translated into strategic objectives, which are imbued with force, whether it's kinetic force or economic force. That's where the rubber meets the road. You take strategic objectives, you harmonize them, you coordinate them, you synchronize them, and you have a strategy. And like policy objectives being achieved through strategic objectives themselves are obtained through operational objectives. That's men and troops on the ground. And operational objectives are in turn accomplished through tactical engagements. Ultimately, Clausewitz said that strategy is the use of the engagement for the political object of the war. So now you have a framework on how to approach who's doing what where, and is it working? The strategy that I propose consists of 6 strategic objectives divided into 3 phases. The first phase is defeat, and that's where we are now. The defeat phase achieves the military end state through local physical destruction of Hamas and the prevention of its immediate resupply. This phase reduces Hamas's capacity to 0 while setting the conditions for capability destruction in subsequent phases. Military operations, 6 to 18 months. Strategic objective 1, local physical destruction of Hamas in Gaza. It's rendered incapable of fielding armed, organized offensive or defensive operations. Now, local physical destruction does not mean Hamas is destroyed everywhere, just locally in Gaza. And it doesn't mean that all the material, non-material elements of support are exhausted, interdicted, or destroyed. Just Hamas's material, tactical instruments of armed power, its leaders, its fighters, its arms and ammunition. And we have to understand that local physical destruction by itself is temporary. Hamas can be resupplied. It can reconstitute itself in the future. Its destruction its tactical and operational incapacity must occur at a point in time for a period of time sufficient to execute subsequent strategic objectives that render these results permanent. The second strategic objective is to prevent resupply. Typically, this would be part of the operation of Gideon's Chariot, but military campaigns like Gideon's Chariot conclude with a military end state. Permanence, which we will discuss, is a strategic objective, and as such is beyond the military end state, which is an operational objective. So as a parallel strategic objective, preventing resupply sets the stage for subsequent strategic objectives beyond the military end state. For example, economic interdiction. If Hamas's central stores of arms and ammunition are exhausted, seized, or destroyed, its only alternative is to utilize Gaza's capital, labor, and resource economies to buy, manufacture, or import more. So Hamas will turn to local dealers, manufacturers, or importers to replace its material losses, which means that interdicting Hamas's capability to resupply requires interdicting Hamas's interface with the capital, labor, and resource economies of Gaza, which is beyond what militaries do. How do you know if you succeeded in phase one, defeat, and it's time to move on to the next phase, control? Well, Hamas seizes organized offensive or defensive operations. Its resupply networks are rolled back. The economic interfaces it has to Gaza's political economy are interdicted, and the military end state is achieved. Hamas is rendered tactically incapable. If you can achieve that, it's time to transition to the control phase, and this is beyond the military end state. Now, I've talked about that a little bit and probably need to define what that is. And this comes out of Joint Publication 5-0 Planning from the U.S. Department of, used to be Defense, now it's War. A military end state is the set of required conditions that defines the achievement of all military objectives. So at this point, 6 to 18 months, the IDF should have achieved all of its military objectives in Gaza. The transition criteria, which we've talked about, define the end of the military end state. Anything beyond that is beyond what a military does or should do. The next phase that I suggest is control, which is governance transition 2 to 5 years. This prevents Hamas's reconstitution while establishing Israeli administrative control beyond Gaza's political economy. This phase moves beyond military instrumentation to comprehensive political economic intervention. And this creates a foundation for a permanent transformation of Gaza's political economy. So I've mentioned strategic permanence for Israel in Gaza. What is that? Strategic permanence means that a post-Hamas, demilitarized, de-radicalized Gaza is the acknowledged status quo of Gazan society, its customary baseline. Now, establishing a customary baseline for Gazan society means removing as well as outlasting local competitors for governance. So permanence requires that the strategic objectives are obtained and maintained until competing customary narratives or widely accessible living memory of a Hamas-run Gaza are gone. Given an average lifespan of 75 and a half years in pre-2023 Gaza, strategic permanence requires a multi-generational effort with a minimum duration of that length. And while this appears to be an enormous task, we've got to remember Israel has already held Gaza for 58 years. And perhaps more importantly, we have to understand that time is a weapon. It either works for you or it works against you. And militaries like the IDF seek swift, decisive action, which is why the control phase is beyond the military end state. Establishing a multi-generational campaign puts time on the side of Israel, not Hamas. Strategic Objective 3, preclude reconstitution. In the sequence of strategic objectives, precluding reconstitution is the first objective that requires expansion beyond the military into broader political economic instruments of power projection. And this strategic objective lays the groundwork for subsequent strategic objectives to permanently interdict, intervene, and reorient Gaza's political economy. Preventing reconstitution requires Israel to transition from local immediate physical destruction to systematically attacking Hamas's local material support, capital, labor, and resources, and its non-material support, the ideological foundations, its authority, legitimacy, and standing in Gaza society and polities. It requires disrupting Hamas's interface with the local political economy and interdicting its foreign resources. Strategic Objective 4, establish a protectorate. Israel must declare Gaza a protectorate and strip it of all political self-determination as part of a comprehensive revolutionary transformation of its political economy. The Gaza of October 7th must cease to exist. This protectorate can and should evolve into either a commonwealth upon meeting harmonization standards or fully integrate with Israel upon meeting integration standards and through mutual agreement. Revolutionary transformation will serve Israel's strategic objectives. Gaza's political sectarian framework, which drove conflict, must be thoroughly discredited and removed. The language of Gaza must be transformed from Arabic to Hebrew. Public sectarianism must be prohibited. Islamic jurisprudence must be removed entirely from Gaza's civil, legal, and political structures. Private religious practice remains personal choice, but public sectarianism, which is a competitor for civil governance, contradicts harmonization's rationale and should be illegal. Educational transformation serves as the primary instrument of social transformation. Mandatory coeducational boarding programs separate the youth cohort from adult influence. It dismantles existing social structures while reducing available labor for competitors to Israel. Female education and participation in civil, political, and legal institutions will be orchestrated to drive revolutionary change in customary society. And it also has a side effect of reducing fertility rates, increasing labor value, and preventing demographic subversion. These transformations will be accomplished through political economic operations in Gaza's political polity, legal polity, and civil polity. How do you know when the control phase has succeeded? There'll be no reconstitution attempts for Hamas or any successor organization for 12 plus months. Israel will have administrative control established across all civic governance functions. The youth cohort, the majority of Gaza's population, will be enrolled in mandatory on-site coeducational programs. Economic activities aligned with Israel and its strategic objectives will be in place. And the Arabic to Hebrew transition will be initiated in legal and administrative functions. Phase 3. Phase 3 is the transform phase. Permanent harmonization and integration, and we're talking 70 years. The transform phase creates a permanent political economy incapable of generating armed, organized violence through comprehensive generational transformation. Strategic Objective 5 is to establish a permanent political economy without armed capability, which requires that we deconstruct the capability to field, to create armed organizations inside Gaza's political economy, which requires that Israel dismantle the material and non-material support systems that created and sustained Hamas. And that goes from the enabling elements, the actors, their assets, the driving forces, the repositories where this was created, as well as the combinatorial and transformational processes that generated a military instrument, a political instrument like Hamas. Gaza's political economy must return to its natural and sustainable levels of activity that preclude armed sectarian organizations. Israel, in order to do this, must exploit systemic vulnerabilities in Gaza's political economy because the repositories and enabling elements that created Hamas and Islamic Jihad and will create successor organizations are parts of systems and they're vulnerable to systemic attack. Israel must focus on the foundation, without permanent change in Gaza's political economy, Hamas or some future genocidal political sectarian organization will at some time in the future take arms and seek Israel's destruction. Permanence requires a strategic focus on the foundations of power, not just its instrumentation. Instrumentation will continuously evolve to seek asymmetric advantages of conflict, like suicide bombers. Permanence requires a focus on how capabilities are created and maintained, not just their immediate and local expression. Strategic Objective 6, the last strategic objective, permanent political orientation. The policy objectives to permanently destroy Hamas, gain security control of Gaza, demilitarize and de-radicalize the population, and place an administration of non-Hamas, non-hostile local elements in charge of post-war Gaza have been obtained. This strategic objective is about how to maintain them. And that requires either development of a commonwealth or an integration pathway. Development of a commonwealth, Gaza's protectorate status is both temporary and transitional. The beginning of a transformational process either ending in a commonwealth status or in full integration with the State of Israel. And commonwealth status means that Gaza's political economy operates with Israel to the degree that they act in each other's best interests, and that Israel manages the foreign and defense affairs of Gaza, and that Gaza operates under biblical values and in Hebrew. Development of an integration pathway is where Gazans and Israelis vote to integrate. This requires cultural transformation. Israel will have to introduce competing transcendence and alternative transcendent motivations through revolutionary social restructuring and cultural ethnogenesis aligned with Israel's proven military success. Religious authority substitution. Israel will have to establish alternative religious leadership that delegitimizes violent armed sectarianism while providing meaningful spiritual alternatives. Education of the population into nonviolent development methods and models. The Gazan youth cohort needs to be educated successfully into nonviolent development models while severing connections to broader violent armed movements. Capital economy operations. Foreign aid must be interdicted. Over $40 billion of U.S. aid, $40 billion U.S. dollars have been contributed by international donors as foreign aid for Palestinians since 1993, making Gaza the highest per capita recipient of foreign aid. This has created an artificiality and fueled unsustainable population growth exceeding natural economic levels. Operational objectives require permanently removing the capability to resupply or reconstitute armed organizations through foreign capital sources. Israel will have to, in this transitory phase, implement economic controls, manage cross-border capital, overview and monitor the banking system, and seek international asset recovery from legally liable international stores of capital used to fund terrorism for damages and reconstruction funding. Labor economy operations, population management. The $8 to $10 billion in foreign aid that flooded Gaza over the past decade fueled unsustainable labor growth, evidenced by 46.6% overall unemployment and 62.3% youth unemployment. Unemployed youth provide the raw material for armed political sectarianism. Therefore, paramount objective is to return labor supply and population growth to natural levels. Israel must induce an educational reform by placing a mandatory coeducational system, a technical education system, and an employment transition to where the youth cohort who has gone through the educational program become the administrators of Gaza. Resource economy operations include state resource control. During the transition, the IDF will hold, as the protectorate will hold all title on land and resources. This provides immediate resourcing of net positive economic development for economic uplift and stability. And it is to ensure commercial development aligns with strategic objectives and policy goals, blocking land sales to partners who might use commercial channels to infiltrate banned political sectarianism. And there has to be an economic transformation from artisanal to a scaled commercial capitalism, ensuring integration is well-resourced. The transformation success metrics, you're talking in year 25, no reconstitution. The first generation is entirely educated in the Israeli system. There is complete capitulation or deportation of opposition leadership and the establishment of local self-regulating and monitoring systems. By year 50, Commonwealth status is achieved or full integration pathway is initiated. There is no living memory of Hamas governance among the active population. There's economic integration that provides stability and opportunity, and there's a complete severing of external resistance support networks. And by year 75, there is either an integration or a permanent Commonwealth status is stabilized. Cultural transformation has eliminated transcendent motivations for violence. Self-regulating local systems are aligned with Israeli founding principles, and there is a Gazan permanent political economy without armed resistance capability. Now, there are obviously going to be a number of predictable objections, and let's go through some of them now. In terms of running a 75-year-long campaign, you have to do some risk mitigation. The typical reconstruction gap, which occurs after the military end state and before the political economy operations start, has been reduced. It's already planned in that they actually overlap each other. So there's no reconstitution gap. Its generational continuity for a 75-year time frame ensures that the processes that Israel sets in place, starting in the control phase, will last throughout the transform phase, 75 years. Now to the international objections. Critics will challenge this framework on legal, moral, and practical grounds. And these objections, while predictable, I think rest on flawed premises that have produced 58 years of strategic failure. International law violations. The protectorate framework operates under legitimate self-defense principles following Gaza's declaration of genocidal war and the systematic targeting of Israeli civilians. Gaza's fundamental breach of international legal norms through October 7th eliminates its claims to sovereign protections. Historical precedents, post-World War II transformation of Japan and Germany, demonstrate that comprehensive political restructuring is both legally justified and practically necessary after existential conflicts. Collective punishment. This framework, the one that I have proposed, targets political legal systems, not ethnic identity. Individual choice remains paramount. Those preferring Islamic jurisprudence may self-deport. Integration pathways remain open to all who accept a new legal framework, regardless of their background. The policy distinguishes between punishment, which is retribution for past acts, and prevention, which is the eliminating of future genocidal capability. Many will argue that this is culturally impossible. But Gaza's own historical transition from a Christian society to an Islamic society demonstrates cultural malleability where political economic incentives align with institutional change. Modern examples include post-apartheid South Africa, post-communist Eastern Europe. They show that comprehensive institutional transformation can reshape social assumptions within a generation when coupled with economic opportunity. The framework I propose offers unprecedented integration into a successful political economy, providing positive incentives that previous occupation models lacked. You'll get the regional destabilization concerns. Well, the current paradigm of cyclical violence and proxy warfare has already destabilized the region catastrophically. And incremental approaches guarantee repetition of October 7th style attacks, while providing enemies of Israel with permanent launching platforms. Regional stability requires eliminating, not managing, the conditions that produce genocidal movements. Success in Gaza demonstrates to other potential aggressors that genocidal wars result in complete political extinction. establishing deterrent effects that incremental responses cannot achieve. Lastly, international opposition. I think we all expect it. International acceptance follows demonstrated success, not prior approval. The international community's previous approaches, the Oslo Accords, Gaza disengagement, two-state solutions, have failed catastrophically while enabling genocidal regimes to gain capability. Once the proposed framework demonstrates measurable improvements in security, economic development, and in social indicators, international recognition will follow practical reality. Israel's strategic requirements for survival supersede international preferences that have consistently failed to prevent genocidal threats. Shoshana, back to you.
I'm not sure where to start, David. So let's start with a couple of things that listeners have put forward, and I'm going to try to put them into a broader framework. Yes, we altered the political as well as the economic and social and cultural futures of Germany and Japan. After World War II, we occupied them. We did it. We wrote Japan's constitution. And for anyone who doesn't know, the reason Japanese women got the right to vote is because a Jewish woman was on the Constitution writing committee. She was a middle-aged Jewish woman at that time, and she said, I just thought it was right. And Japanese women ever since can thank her. But there are people who have questioned here whether that kind of long-term change, particularly as the Arabic and Muslim population of Gaza are connected to a larger Arabic and Muslim population in the broader Middle East, whether changing the language and all of that can be done without removing their identity and without using the assets available from, let's say, UAE and Bahrain, who have gone through this de-radicalization process on their own and created a workable system that can live with Israel in the Middle East. So by thinking that Israel has to do it all, and the end game has to be Arabs who are Israelis, in essence, or like Israelis, does that go too far?
That's a great question. And,
That's like 6 questions altogether.
When you propose a framework, you deal in absolutes. And when reality hits, you have to adjust. But Islam, and I don't use radical or militant or any of that, when you have Islam in a failed state, it effectively takes over and in some cases goes to its worst extremes. In Bahrain, in Saudi, in the other 55 Muslim majority nations, Islam has a place, but it is restrained by the state institution. In failed states, there is none of that. So Israel has to establish a state institution in Gaza that can restrain the worst impulses of any sectarian orientation. And it's the old military acronym is it's hard to get harder and it's easy to get easier. So you start out hard, and then as your success metrics are achieved, you can relax the constraints on things. So that's why I suggest that in the beginning, public sectarianism in a failed state is a clear competitor for civil governance. And you can't fund your own competitors. You have to allow them to self-deport or to accept the new civic administration. And so you have the customary society, you have the civic polity, the legal polity, and the political polity. And the political polity is gone. Israel is taking, as a protectorate, will take over the political functions of Gaza. But the civic and legal polities need to be reorganized such that it can restrain an otherwise unrestrained Islam in Gaza, which has resulted in subject populations being butchered not only by their own folks. I mean, if you look at what Hamas did in 2007 to the Fatah competitors, they had a campaign of assassination all over Gaza, and then basically took over through armed intimidation, created a subject population. And to move a subject population into participatory citizens requires a civic structure that is accessible by all and security to access it by each individual.
Which makes sense. I would point out that you want to use those assets of Arab countries that have undergone this process. We had a guest on this program some time ago who's a Saudi expert and went to Saudi Arabia and went to the Saudi National Museum. And what he discovered, and this was, I would say, a year and a half ago, that there was no mention in the Saudi National Museum of Wahhabis or Wahhabism. They removed it. They removed it. And you know what Wahhabism did to Saudi Arabia, what it made of Saudi Arabia. It's gone. And so I would simply say that using those assets and those aligned countries would be helpful to Israel. But you may be right that you start with simply Israelis and you bring in the Arabs as you go.
Right.
So here is another question from a listener. When you talk about protectorate status, you're not necessarily talking about the annexation of Gaza. You are accepting that Gaza could be separate from the state of Israel as protectorates. You know, the French, as much as they complain about Israel, have 14 protectorates around the world. New Caledonia would like to be independent, and the French said no. Britain has protectorates. We have Puerto Rico. So you can have a protectorate separate from yourself. And is that what you're saying Gaza could be?
In fact, Shoshana, I think it has to be that way. You can't have Israelis going in and establishing enclaves of Israeli culture and law inside Gaza. It has to be a single civic structure that applies to all inhabitants of Gaza. So it is its own separate entity, civic, legal, and customary, and it's on a pathway to either become an independent and aligned commonwealth, or fully integrate with Israel. So it is a separate political structure.
Okay, and it stays that way, at least for the foreseeable future. You mentioned one of the strategic objectives was to get rid of certain institutions. There are many institutions that need to go, but if you align that with the money, are you talking about getting rid of things like UNRWA? Are you talking about getting rid of those things that funded and exacerbated the problems? If you look at the schools in Gaza, excuse me, which are primarily, excuse me, UNRWA schools, that's where the indoctrination of children happens. So are you talking about getting rid of those international institutions that are subversive to the concept of a progressive and open Gaza?
Well, let's start with what Hamas itself said in its founding charter. And it consisted of 36 articles, 2 of which dealt exclusively with education, where it must be denuded of any competing Western influences. So Hamas understands the value of education. And in order to create a new society where you don't have a subject population who is used and abused by armed terroristic leadership, you must educate them into that. And the majority of Gaza right now is under 18. So it is on Israel, both immediately and to the near-term future, to introduce them into an educational approach which prepares them for a new society, a revolutionary society, which inculcates them with the values that they will need to manage their own society in 75 years' time, whether they decide to go as an independent commonwealth or to integrate. But that can't happen if you allow capital-backed subversion or institutional-backed subversion of those strategic objectives to happen. So UNRWA has to go. Israel must establish, in fact, it may be the most important element of this whole process, is a comprehensive coeducational, mandatory on-site educational program.
So it also should be noticed. I mean, we didn't talk at all, and I don't think we're going to, about the West Bank, which is not quite the same, but it's not altogether different from the problems of Gaza. But I think we're not going to go there. But there is a third group, excuse me, which is Israeli Arabs, who are modern, full citizens of the state of Israel. And it bears saying because I think sometimes people forget this. 20% of Israel's population is minority. Most of them are Arabs. Now, there are Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, but they go to school in Israel. They learn Israeli life. They learn Israeli culture. They learn Israeli education, but they're still Arabs and they are primarily Muslims. But it should, it's one thing to understand that more than 50% of the pharmacists in Israel are Arabs because it was an area that they could go into and study and be productive and all that. So it seems that there are lessons to learn from the integration of Israeli Arabs, even though the difference is Israeli Arabs are Israeli and citizens, and you're not talking about that in Gaza. But the educational process, which allows them to maintain their Arabism, but also to participate in a modern, I don't want to say secular state, it's not a secular state, a modern, open and democratic state where you can be whatever religion you want to be. Christians in Gaza should really appreciate that because Christians in Gaza have been persecuted and discriminated against for a very long time. So that should actually be appealing to them. But there's a model here in Israeli Arabism.
I think that that's a huge cultural resource that has to be mobilized to do this too, because they can bring their experiences as to the value of living under a society organized on I'll be upfront, on biblical values, Judeo-Christian values, not the absolutism that unrestrained Islam requires. So you have people who could run this education program from their own experience right now if Israel wanted to mobilize them.
I would think they would have to, frankly, I would think they would have to mobilize them because you need Arabic-speaking people. And although Arabic is an official language of the state of Israel, you need people who speak Arabic to speak directly to the citizens of Gaza. They should learn Hebrew. They probably will learn Hebrew, but you got a long way to go there. We have a question.
You had 75 years to get there.
Yes. And I would also say, which I've said many times before, in the year 1970, which is a pretty long time ago, Life magazine ran a cover story on the PLO's summer camps teaching young children to aspire to shooting weapons and killing people, and specifically killing Israelis and killing Jews. This is 1970. Okay, this is long before a lot of the other things that transpired. Israel was still trying to give the Gaza Strip back to Egypt in 1970. Okay, so yes, you've had a lot of decades of that kind of irredentist education, and that needs to be uprooted. We did have a question from somebody going back to your the military points that you made earlier. Crisis response operations and making sure that Hamas is not able to reconstitute itself or import weapons or import the capability to produce weapons. Would it seem to you that Israel's operations in Gaza have cut off the access of that to Hamas? Where would they be getting weapons? I know they're still getting money, some money. But Israel is sitting on the Rafah border now. Has Israel managed to cut off the resupply of weapons themselves to Hamas?
Well, when you attack resupply, the first thing you have to do, resupply is a distribution network. So you have elements in the field, and there's a logistics chain that get arms and ammunition to them. The first thing you do is roll back that network so that the elements in the field either have to cease fighting because they no longer have any arms and ammunition, or they move to a central location where they become vulnerable. The next thing you have to do is you have to seize, destroy, or interdict the shipment of any arms to those central areas. So Israel, by its physical presence in central Gaza, has stopped resupply, but resupply occurs outside where they exercise, mandatory control over the ground, over the terrain. But part of moving from military operations to preventing reconstitution requires that the Israeli military and its intelligence services do an economic terrain map of Gaza: who produces what, where, who sells what to whom, and a financial trace on top of that. How does payment go? Because those are the indicators and warnings on who's producing arms, who's shipping and distributing arms, who's importing arms. And they need to do that not just for stopping local physical resupply, but for precluding reconstitution once you move out of the defeat phase into the control phase.
So
Most militaries don't do that. They rarely track the capital, the labor, or the resources used and the distribution of arms and ammunition or the creation of arms and ammunition. I'm sure Hamas has arms factories buried that are operating today that Israel doesn't know about.
so after all of the operations in Gaza up to date, you think there are still factories that they haven't found? I know they've found a lot of stuff. You think there's still ones that they haven't found that could be reconstituted if they're not careful?
Well, even if every factory, every gun, every ammunition was seized in Gaza, if they can obtain capital, then they can buy the labor and resources to reconstitute it, or they can import it. Wherever the IDF isn't, is where you probably have manufacturing and distribution going on of arms and ammunition. So I would definitely look in the southern part of Gaza where the IDF really isn't.
Uh, okay, so again, this goes to your point that maximum control is important at the beginning because maximum control, in other words, money, supply routes, borders, all of those things, maximum control first, and moving toward less stringent control in some places if that's possible.
Right, and I think you have to look at it. I'll give you a simple model for a political economy looking at this. I mean, people have been writing about political economy since Aristotle, but when I deal with this operationally, what I look at is you have the political and the economic, and those are two categories. Under the political, which is about the transference of power, you have customary society, which defines the relationship between the individual and every level of society that they deal with. You have the civic polity, which is the internal distribution of political power through policies. We have law enforcement and taxes and regulation. You have the legal polity, which develops the jurisprudence that mitigates between the political polity, where power is obtained and transferred, and the civil polity and the customary side. And these are all interrelated. And on the economy side, you have capital economy, that's money, credit, equity, debt, assets, and liabilities. Labor, which is any physical or mental use of thought and power to help produce or distribute things. And then you have resources, which is commodities, minerals, agricultural land, all of those things. And so all of these, it's categorically interrelated and cross-related. So if you affect labor, you're going to affect the distribution of power in the civic polity. If you affect the security of the civic polity, you're going to make labor probably more fluid, more flexible, that can move up and down the value chain. So all these things are interrelated, and it's something that you have to take into consideration when you start doing moves beyond the military end state.
So we're coming close to wrapping up here. And it seems to me that the overall wrap up of what you've said is that a policy that Israel pursued for many, many years, which is what they called cutting the grass, was a failure at the end of the day, because what they were doing was taking out the things that were the day-to-day threat or the most immediate threat. So they would take out the 2021 rocket war. They took out rockets. They took out supplies of rockets. They took out all kinds of things having to do with rockets. Did the same to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They took out the immediate threat. They also removed individuals who were problematic. And they considered that cutting the grass, that cutting off those immediate was going to ultimately result in, I don't know what, security peace. I don't know.
It resulted
That's what they were doing. But you're right.
It resulted in adversaries that were better trained on how to avoid and evade Israeli military engagement and while accomplishing their mission. So they were training their adversaries to be stronger, more brutal, more effective.
Okay, so there's no return to the Gaza prior to 2005. I mean, you can't go back that way. You have to You have to go forward. This leads to one political question. I don't like to do political questions, but I'm going to do one here, and you can decline to answer. As you know, if Israel takes those steps and Israel sets this as a set of policies that they're going to pursue, the US is probably going to be fairly well behind it as long as we have the current president, but at some point we will not. France, Britain, Ireland, Spain, all kinds of people, all kinds of UN bodies, they're going to have a stroke.
Yeah.
Or hives or something, I don't know. How does Israel deal with that? Is it possible that those guys, in pursuit of their sort of pie in the sky two-state solution, and they still talk about it, no one in Israel does, but they still talk about it, that they can derail the whole thing? They are big, they are economically powerful, they are supposed to be Israel's friends, but they're not.
Well, Israel will present them with a dilemma because Israel will establish a protectorate whose ultimate end is either in a commonwealth or in full integration. So there is a state there in being, and it's a transitory period to it. And ironically, Israel will give the dead enders who cannot abide a new society the option to self-deport. And where should they self-deport but to those that most argue against the transition to a commonwealth status? So ironically, maybe France would be willing to take in 1 million Gazans, or perhaps Qatar or Yemen, to be even more ironic.
That would be interesting. Okay, wrap up. I always ask a guest to end on a positive note. So as you look at the situation today, and you look at what I think is a very interesting plan that you put forward, I would nitpick a few things with you, but I won't. What's your optimistic note to leave our listeners today?
If you give a solution that ends in a successful society for both Israelis and Gazans with a set timeline, then the existential threat that is Gaza today could be one of Israel's greatest allies tomorrow.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank you very much. I mean, this was, people are going to be processing this for a very long time. But to our listeners, while you're processing, next week we're going on Tuesday. Can't help it. I hate to shake the system, but we're going on Tuesday. But we're also going to flip the geography. We're going to do China next Tuesday. Our guest is Dr. Stephen Bryan. You've heard him before. I hear him every day at home since he is my husband. And he will come and do China military policy and construction of military assets. And he is going to compare that to what the U.S. is doing to produce the assets that we need to defend ourselves and how that balances out and how that works out. You'll get an invitation, but think Tuesday. David Katz, thank you for joining us. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you, and thanks to the Jewish Policy Center for hosting this.